And so we're focusing on how memories are formed, stored, retrieved, how we think and analyze information, and finally language development. So for tonight, our memory, what we're focusing on with cognition is memory. And basically how, the Myers textbook defines memory is information that has been acquired, stored, and can be retrieved. And so if you want to think about it from the learning unit, which we wrapped up right before winter break, it's basically just learning that persists over time. So there's definitely a relationship there, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those learning principles later actually in this unit. And so memory is really, I think, an interesting topic in psychology because there are so many extremes of memory. For example, someone who maybe suffers a stroke may for the rest of their lives be unable to process new memories. And so they wake up every day kind of like with a blank slate. They don't remember what they ate for breakfast. They don't remember, that they went and saw their friend or that they watched a TV show, things like that. Like that's an extreme of memory, which is obviously pretty rare. On the other end, though, we have savants and people with extreme memories who can look at a deck of cards and then recite it back to you, or who can recite all the digits of pi, out for 100 numbers. And so the human mind is really capable of so much in regards to memory. And so we're going to talk mostly about quote unquote normal or average memory, but we will get into a little bit of the extremes as we progress. The other cool thing about memory is that it's not just a conscious process. So I don't have to actively be like thinking or rehearsing something to remember it. We have an unconscious track for our memory as well. And so we can store and retrieve memories through that. So the first thing that we have to talk about is the way that psychologists approach studying about memory. And there's three basic models that you need to be able to recognize. The first is called the Information Processing Model. And this one is, if you want to think of an analogy like a computer. And so basically, this model says that our memory works much like a computer's operation system. And so there's three basic steps to getting a memory into your brain, according to this model. So first is the encoding aspect. And so encoding is how we get it in. So I like to think of it, if you open up a Word document and you're typing in the Word document, that's the encoding process. You're putting the information in. The storage then is how you keep it in. So to me, again, if we're working on that Microsoft Word doc, when I hit the save button, that's the storage aspect. And then later on, when I want to come back to that memory, I have to be able to retrieve it or get it out. And so I go to my Documents tab on my computer and click and open the document, and that's the retrieval. So I think if you think of the information processing model, and that sounds kind of techy anyways, so if you think of that like a computer, encode, inputting the info, storage, hitting the save button, retrieving, opening the document, that kind of helps you remember that model of information. A second model or a second approach to memory is the Connectivism Model. And I would say that none of these are like entirely complete on their own. They kind of work together. So it's not like one is right and one is wrong. So the Connectivism Model focuses more on the neural networks in our brain and how they give rise to memories. And so unlike a computer, our brains operate through parallel processing. So it can do multiple things at once. And so the patterns that arise from all of these things happening in my brain form the memories. And so we learned in the bio unit, the more that you practice something, the stronger those neural connections become, the more plentiful they become. That's how our memories work as well. The more time I spend rehearsing or thinking about something, the stronger that neural network in my brain gets, which means that it's stronger, that memory is safer or stored better in my brain. And so when you study for a test and you're going through your flashcards, that's what you're doing, is strengthening those neural connections in your brain, helping you later on to retrieve that information. And then the last memory model that you need to be familiar with is the Atkinson-Shiffrin Model. And this one has three main steps to memory formation. We first record information as a fleeting sensory memory. And a sensory memory is really just the sensory info that you're taking in at any given time, the brief looking at a picture, the sound coming in from down the hall, whatever it is, it's those bits of sensory information that are coming in. That's your sensory memory. It's really short because if you don't think about it, it just goes away, it disappears. So when we focus, though, on remembering something, that info is then processed into our short-term memory. So if I'm looking at a painting, as I study it and think about it, that's my short-term memory. I'm looking at it, thinking about it, I'm rehearsing it, and so it is being practiced, and eventually it will be stored. If I practice it enough, it moves into my long-term memory, where I later can retrieve that message. So this model is pretty well accepted. We're going to talk a lot more about it as we go. The other two still have pros and cons, but the Atkinson-Shiffrin is a pretty standard model for memory. However, there have been some updates recently, and the term short-term memory is kind of losing favor in the psychological community because it's not explanatory enough, I guess you could say. And so instead, the model now includes something called working memory, which we will on this slide. So working memory, which is basically just an updated version of short-term memory, and it's more of a focus on the active process, right? If something's in my short-term memory, it's not just like sitting there. I'm usually thinking about it. I'm actively either rehearsing it by mentally repeating it over and over in my head, or I'm like looking at something and actively thinking about it. And so basically this idea of working memory is more of an active, interactive process. And so there's more of a focus on the fact that memories don't just all of a sudden go from short-term to long-term memory. They get there because we are rehearsing and working memory at remembering that information. So it's just an updated version of short-term memory as that idea has evolved over time. All right, so how do we then get that information from our short-term memory into long-term memory? Like, what is this idea of encoding that we keep coming across in these different models? Because all of the models are talking about encoding. They may be talking about it a little bit differently, but it has to happen. And so encoding is basically how we get that information into our long-term memory. And there's two basic tracks that you need to know. There's automatic processing, which is the one we're going to talk about right now. And so, like the name implies, automatic processing happens pretty automatically with little to no effort. Basically, it's information that skips your conscious awareness and goes directly into storage. So things like if you got up this morning and then you brushed your teeth and you took a shower and you ate breakfast. In your mind, you're not actively like rehearsing or trying to remember these tasks, right? You're not like, first I brushed my teeth, then I went and took a shower. But if I asked you, what'd you do this morning? You'd be able to tell me those tasks in order because you'd remember them. So that's an example of automatic processing. It's just a memory that gets unconsciously encoded. It skips your like conscious awareness and goes right into your memory system. These memories are called implicit memories. So the process that you're undergoing is automatic processing, which leads us to implicit memory. So automatic processing leads to memories. And so other examples of things that would be representative of automatic processing would be if you've ever studied a textbook and then you have to look back to the page that has a vocab word on it. Say you're looking for the word neuron in your textbook and you had just read it. You probably can like flip back to the page and find it pretty quickly in the textbook, even though you weren't like actively trying to record where it was in your textbook. You still process that information on the like unconscious track and remembered where it was. Other things would be like procedural skills, like riding a bicycle, playing an instrument if you're well versed at that instrument. Those sorts of things become automatic processes, which become implicit memories. So then if we have a simple automatic process for encoding information, we must also have an effortful, or a process that we have to work at. And so effortful processing is more of your like traditional study. That's when you're actively working at remembering information. You're practicing it in your head. You're rereading, you're reviewing, you're doing all of these things to make sure that that information sticks in your head. So effortful processing leads to what we call explicit memories, ones that we've rehearsed or practiced. And so an example of this would be anything in like AP Psychology that you've studied would involve effortful processing. Rehearsal, so reading your flashcards and looking through them. The first time you learn to ride a bike or play an instrument, it takes effort. And so those sorts of things are a little bit tricky to remember because they start out effortful and explicit, but as we become experts or masters at those sorts of tasks, they then switch to becoming more automatic processes. So that is kind of the two different examples of encoding that you need to know, automatic versus effortful. And I think the names are pretty self-explanatory. So if you just remember automatic happens automatically, I don't think you'll have too much of a hard time with that. So how do we get that information then that we're encoding? And this is what's kind of the start of the memory process if we had like a hierarchy of how things worked. Well, we have to take that information in from our sensory memory. So sensory memory is like the input, the information first coming in. And so it's just exactly what your senses are getting without any actual processing happening. So if you think back to the sensation and perception unit, it's the sensation, basically. The sight, the sound, the smell, those sorts of things. And this is what feeds then our working memory. This is what feeds the short-term memory, the information that we're inputting that we then can actively rehearse or forget. And so there's two types of sensory memory that you have to be familiar with for the purposes of AP Psychology. And one is iconic memory, and iconic deals with your eye. So I think it's just easy to remember iconic, eyeball. It just helps you remember. But basically an iconic memory is just a visual stimuli, and it's there, and if you don't actively think about it and you look away, it's gone. So it's a very, very brief photographic image imprinted in detail, and it fades really quickly, right? Because if I turn my head and look at something else, that old image is gone and it's replaced with this new image. So unless I actually use my working memory and start to think and process it, whatever that other visual stimuli is gone, it's disappeared, it's gone forever. And so basically, echoic memory then is the exact same thing, except echo deals with our ears, right? We hear an echo. And so it's an auditory stimuli instead of a visual stimuli. So those two are pretty much the same thing, just iconic deals with eyes, echoic deals with hearing, echo, that's how we hear things. And so again, if we don't actively process or think about it, we lose that information. But this is where we get the info that goes into our working memory. So our working memory, kind of back to this topic or idea, is limited. So we talked about extremes of memory, and there can be a wide range of short-term and working memory. But every year I do a demo with my students to kind of show this because everyone thinks, oh, I can remember so much information, right? But typically speaking, we say that our short-term or our working memory is capable of holding 7 bits of information plus or minus 2. So basically, like 90% of the population can remember 5 to 9 pieces of information before they start to forget stuff. And the easiest way to like demonstrate this is I just start off by reading kids a list of numbers. And so I'll read out the numbers, and then I'll pause and have them write the numbers down from memory. Then I'll read a new list of numbers, and so on and so forth. And so most kids can remember between 5 and 9 of those digits when I do that activity. Some kids might remember the string of 12 digits that I give them, but that's pretty rare. And so we see that most people with their short-term or working memory fall into this 7 plus or minus 2 range. And the reason why this happens is because our working memory requires us to be thinking about and processing that information. And when it gets too full, basically we start to lose bits of information because it's like over capacity. And so then if we stop actively rehearsing or actively thinking about one of those things, it's gone forever because it hasn't made its way into our long-term memory yet. There's also a lot of variation to this. If I put you in a noisy conference room where there's all kinds of people walking around, your capacity to remember a list of numbers would be probably lower because there'd be other distractions and things going on in the room, and it would impact your abilities. Age is also a factor. Older adults have less working memory. When I say older, I mean like way older adults. You could also be like time of day. If you've had a long, stressful day, your working memory may have less capacity than it does in the morning when you're alert and wide awake. So it's not a hard, fast rule, but it's pretty typical, 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. So the really cool thing that I like about this unit is we're talking about learning, we're talking about memory, but it gives you so many good study strategies. Like, these are the things psychologists are telling you that help you remember information. You should be using them to study for your tests, and not just in psychology, but in all classes across the board. And so we're going to talk a little bit on the next couple of slides about how we can use effortful processing. And so if you think back, effortful means we're putting in effort, we're actively working to remember information. And so here these strategies are like proven to help you become more successful. Is one example of an effortful processing strategy. And basically it's when we organize information into smaller, more manageable chunks. So like if someone asked for your phone number, you wouldn't go 762-555-2246 because that's not a manageable chunk of information. Usually we would start with the area code 722-555, and I don't remember what else I said, 4622. But you break it into those chunks, and then because it has a familiar pattern, because of the phone number pattern, right, it's more easy for you to remember that information instead of just listing the numbers. It's the same amount of numbers, it requires the same amount of memory, but breaking it into those familiar chunks makes it much easier for us to remember the information. Mnemonics are another useful tool, and a mnemonic device, I'm sure you've heard of them or used them before. It's any sort of memory aid. So like my example before with like iconic relating to eye and vision, that's an example of a mnemonic device. It's just giving you some sort of a memory tip or trick to help remember something. A lot of times they use visual or vivid imagery as well. And so another example of this would be like Roy G. Biv. So you're using the colors to like help remember like what order the rainbow goes in. And so actually Roy G. Biv is a good example of both because it uses chunking, Roy G. Biv, and then it uses the mnemonic of the letters representing colors to help you remember the order in which the rainbow goes. So mnemonics and chunking can like overlap and be the same thing, if that makes sense. Other strategies that you can use in studying are hierarchies. These are really useful to help you like organize information. I would say the bio unit is really great for hierarchies because you can look back and break the brain down into different chunks and different pieces, or the body systems. You know, you start with like the central nervous system and then break it into other parts. And so basically it just gives us some like categories, and it helps us organize our information into meaningful units, into information that's more easily understood. And this is what I can't stress enough, this last strategy, distributed practice. I harp on my students about this all the time, and they still don't listen, and you probably aren't going to listen either, but I promise you distributed practice is so much better for studying, for long-term information retention. And so distributed practice is what it sounds like. You distribute the practice over time, meaning instead of studying for 3 hours for AP Psychology the night before the test, try to study 20 to 30 minutes a night for 3 nights leading up to the test. So distributing the practice over multiple nights is proven to help you remember more information over time than cramming does. Cramming is bad. You can only retain focus for so long, and then basically you're losing bits and pieces of information left and right. So spacing effect goes with distributed practice, and it just says that studying over a period of time is more effective for long-term memory. You may think you remember it. You might even remember it temporarily, like for the test the next day. But remember, we're studying for a test in May. And so the more information that you can secure deep into your long-term memory, the better long-term. So distributed practice is definitely the way to go. So I know it might be like, oh, I can't find the time, but really setting aside, multiple nights to study is much more beneficial to you. And then the last kind of effortful processing strategy has to do with the level that we process the information at. There's shallow processing, which is not good. You don't want to do that. And then there's deep processing, which is good. So shallow processing is just basically encoding on a super minimal basic level. You focus on the words themselves, like the letters, the sounds. And so to me, that's like if you have your flashcards out, if you do flashcards for vocab, and you're just like, neuron. A neuron is da 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 da. And then you go to the next card. A dendrite is da da da. You're just kind of like reading words and thinking about what the words say, but you're not actually thinking about the deeper meaning there. So just kind of like remembering words and kind of the sounds of the words, that's really just a shallow level of processing. Deep processing is when we encode semantically. We actually get at the root of the meaning of the words, and we make some sort of deep connection to it. And so when my students do flashcards, not only do they have to write the definition, but they have to make a personal sort of connection to the word. They can do that by drawing a picture. They could do that by using it in like a sentence. What else? Making a connection to their life if they know something about one of those terms, connecting it to themselves personally. And the reason that I have them do this is because that's a deeper level of processing. If they can make that connection somehow to the term, then they have a much better chance of remembering that term later on, like on the test. And so I do a demo to show my students this, and I can just tell you a little bit about it. But basically, the students are given a list of phrases that I read out loud. And some of them are kind of silly. Like one of the phrases is, the silly snake slithers down the sliding board. And half the students are given a set of instructions that say, listen to how the sentence sounds. Is it easy to say? And they rank it on yes or no. Is it easy to say? The other students are given instructions that say, listen to the sentence. How easy is it to visualize what is being said? And so slithering snake sliding down the sliding board, that's kind of easy to visualize, right? A snake sliding down a board. And so after I read all of these sentences out, there's like 20 of them, I then ask them questions, and they have to answer the questions. And typically speaking, the students who had to visualize, which is a deeper level of processing, remember 15 to 20 of the 20 terms. The students who were just told to listen to the words and how they sounded only remember between 5 and 10 of the words. And so that's a really basic example, but it should be pretty powerful to show how important it is to make that connection, some sort of visual or some sort of deeper connection to the terms, because it really is beneficial in the retention of information. So I would encourage you, even if your teacher doesn't require some sort of connection on your vocab, to start doing that, because it really would be beneficial. So that kind of gets us through the short term and the sensory memory. That's how the information gets in. Now the long-term memory is how we keep it in. How, now that I've studied, how does that information stay in there, and how do I get it out? And so unlike our working memory, our long-term memory is basically limitless. Think about all the song lyrics, every song that comes on the radio, you can sing along to. That's all long-term memory. There's really no capacity. Obviously, brain injuries and things like that can impact our long-term memory, but there's never really it's full and now, I can't learn anything else. And so one important name that you need to remember from this unit is Elizabeth Loftus. And Elizabeth Loftus is a memory researcher, and she actually works with criminals who have been wrongly convicted and she's super interesting. She does a TED Talk if you are at all interested in this about memory. But basically, she's discovered that like eyewitness testimony, so if I saw someone rob a bank and then I'm called upon to testify in court, it's super unreliable. Many of the things that we relive, like memories that we pull out, end up being invented or made up or modified in our heads. And so what happens is when we remember a memory, one small aspect might be off or might get changed, right? It could even just depend on the mood that we're in that day. And so part of the memory is altered. And then the next time that I think about that memory, I'm remembering not the memory itself, but I'm remembering the last time I thought about that memory. And so basically, the more times I pull up a memory, the more chances that it's being altered and changed in my mind are occurring. And so things like eyewitness testimony, the more you testify and talk about something, you're not necessarily as reliable as you think you are. And so our memories can kind of trick us and play like tricks on us. We think we remember something really vividly, but in reality, we've warped it or changed it in our heads. The other thing that's important about long-term memory is that there's no like spot in my brain where my memories reside. There's parts of my brain that work on helping me store and retrieve memories, but they're all over. Our cortices are responsible for memory development. There's no like specific area. So getting back into our memory systems, we talked a little bit about effortful and explicit memory systems earlier, but we need to talk about how we basically store this information. So we talked about how effortful or explicit memory systems take effort, but how is our brain actually handling that information? And so what you need to know is that our frontal lobes are really important in our working memory. So when I'm actively reciting a phone number in my head, I'm trying to remember it. That's my frontal lobe at work. It's like, oh, remember this number, remember this number. Frontal lobe is at work trying to do that. And it's actually really interesting if you think back to the bio unit, how we have left brain, right brain. It's kind of true in memory processing as well. The left brain or the left frontal lobe deals with trying to recall a password or trying to remember a phone number, kind of keeping that actively in our working memory. And then the right side of our brain deals with more like spatial awareness, visuals, things like that, spatial, abstract, things like that. So that's where the working memory takes place. That's where I'm actively reciting and rehearsing information. The hippocampus then takes over, and that's kind of like clicking the save button. Once the hippocampus takes over, it's kind of moving from working memory into long-term memory. And so the hippocampus saves my explicit memories. We're still talking just about explicit memories. And again, the hippocampus has two sides to it as well. The left deals with verbal information, passwords, logic, things like that. The right deals with abstract visuals, designs, things like that. And so with people with damage to their hippocampus, either through a stroke or through surgery or other things, actually can't often process new memories into their long-term memory. And there's a famous case study. It's called Patient HM. I would look it up if it's not in your book. But basically, this guy had a lot of seizures. And this was back in the day when they would often do like brain surgery and be like, oh, we'll see what happens. And so literally his doctor was like, I'm going to remove your hippocampus and see what happens. And so they did. They removed his hippocampus to see if it would help with his seizures. And it did, but it had a side effect. He no longer, patient HM, could no longer form new memories. So he would get up in the morning and he would watch the same movie he'd watched the day before, except it was brand new to him. He thought it was hilarious or he thought it was sad or whatever type of movie it was. Even if he'd seen it hundreds of times before, it was brand new to him every single time. If he went to a friend's house, he'd always have to say, where's the bathroom? Because he wouldn't remember where the bathroom is. He wouldn't even remember like eating breakfast. So someone had to kind of help care for him in some ways because he wouldn't remember some of the most basic daily tasks and things that he had done. So his intelligence was fine. He was an adult when this happened. So he still had all of his basic like reading skills and then his IQ wasn't altered, but he just never formed new memories from that point onward. And so this is how we really discovered that the hippocampus plays a super important role in our processing of memories, getting them into the long-term storage. And so the hippocampus is not where the memories are stored, so be careful about that. It's just the place where we like finish the processing of them, and then they're sent into long-term storage. And then our implicit memory system, again, these are these automatic kind of unconscious processes. This involves our cerebellum. So you need to know that part of the brain is involved. And basically, it deals with our more automatic processes. So like singing along to the radio. It doesn't require really any effort or conscious thought. When that song or that beat comes on, you just are able to recite those lyrics. The other part of the brain that goes with this, we don't, at least I don't talk about this a ton, but you need to know the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia just has to do with the procedural memory skills, riding a bike, playing a guitar chord, kicking a soccer ball. It's more like physical memories, like how your body remembers to do certain things. And so those are the two parts of the brain that are most associated with the automatic processes or the implicit memory systems. And so what's interesting to note is a lot of times, okay, if you think back, like what's your earliest memory? And for me, I can remember stuff in like kindergarten. So I was like 5-ish years old. Those are the first kind of memories that stick out to me. And so that doesn't mean that I didn't do anything before that time period, but my hippocampus is actually like one of the last parts of my brain to mature. And so that's why you don't really remember being a baby or being a toddler. It's because your hippocampus isn't fully formed or fully functioning yet. And so you're incapable of storing a lot of those memories. However, you as a toddler learn how to speak, you learn how to walk, you learn how to crawl, you learn how to do those things. Those are the implicit memory systems, the automatic processes that take over. And so your cerebellum and your basal ganglia are fully formed when you're a baby. So you're able to learn skill type things, but you're not able to learn and remember like facts and figures or effortful things. So infantile amnesia arises from that fact that our hippocampus is not fully developed. I don't know if that would, I think I have seen that pop up on the AP test, like what causes infantile amnesia, and it's the lack of hippocampus development. So just kind of a side note to remember that. We have a few more things to go through. Like I said, this is a huge unit, so I'm trying to cover as much as possible. But again, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. So the other important part about memory formation is our hormones and our emotion, because they're strongly linked to our memory. Our emotions, and we learned about this in the bio unit, trigger hormones in our body, and the hormones help influence memory formation. Stress, for example, so if I'm in a stressful situation, activates my amygdala. My amygdala is near my hippocampus, and that boosts activity then in that area. And so a lot of times our most strong or vivid memories have to do with pain or fear or stress, because those two are so closely linked in our brain that we're able to, the memory saves more easily. A flashbulb memory then is just a significant event that is kind of like almost seared into your memory. An example of that would be like for me, reliving or remembering the morning of like 9/11, because it was a really strong, emotionally significant event. And so I have a lot of like strong visuals and things that go along with that. The other thing though to note is that yes, stress can help you form strong memories, but over time it can be a negative thing, right? So constantly being stressed and constantly being on edge, that's not a good thing either, because actually the stress can corrode or like get rid of those neural connections in your brain, and it shrinks or shrivels up your hippocampus because it gets so like overworked and overwhelmed that it kind of like shrivels up. So we don't like want to have stress, obviously, not only physically for like your body, but also for your brain as well. That's not a good thing. In our long-term memory, we also have something called episodic memory. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I like this chart that's here. So if you're studying like different memory systems, I might try and keep track of the this little like diagram, because it is a hierarchy, right? We talked about that before. So we're using this information to help us remember. But an episodic memory is just my unique memory of a specific event. And so two people can experience the exact same thing and really recall it differently. So for example, you know, at my wedding, there was 120 people-ish. And we all experienced the same day, right? We saw the wedding, we did the thing. But if we all talked about it, we'd all probably have different experiences and different ways of interpreting that event. And so the episodic memory is your unique interpretation of that event. All right, so now we're just going to talk a little bit about the bio part of it. And so the synaptic changes link back to what we talked about at the beginning with the connectivism model. But basically, we know that experience modifies our brain's neural networks. So whether it's experience of reading my flashcards and trying to remember that information, or experience of like I'm practicing how to play the guitar and I'm moving my fingers and doing that. Any type of experience, any type of learning is modifying the neural networks in my brain. Those networks, the neurons are firing, they're strengthening, they're getting a stronger connection. And what causes this, and this is the big thing that you have to take away from this, is long-term potentiation. This is an important term in regards to learning. And so long-term potentiation basically says that once I fire a cell, so let's say I'm firing a cell to remember how to play an A chord on the guitar. I don't even know if you can play an A chord on the guitar. I'm just making this up. So I'm firing the cells in my brain that require me to move my hands and play an A chord. After I've done that, that brief and rapid stimulation increases the firing potential for next time. Basically, I've put it on edge, it's ready to fire, and so it could fire again more quickly. And so the more and more times I fire it, the more and more active it becomes and the more ready it is to fire again the next time. And so basically, this is believed to be the neural basis, the smallest kind of neural connection that we can make for the learning process. As my cells fire and respond to what I'm learning, those responses become stronger, they become more vivid, they become more apt to firing again in the future. And so the more I practice it, those networks grow and become stronger, which means that information is more likely to be retained in my brain. Hopefully that makes sense, because sometimes long-term potentiation is confusing. It's just basically an increase in the firing capacity through the process of learning. All right. So a couple more things. I love this model. I like hierarchies, if you can tell. We've seen a few hierarchies already today, but this is a good strategy for helping to kind of organize the information that I've presented today. So basically, we have two tracks of memory processing, the automatic and the effortful, which leads to either the implicit or the explicit memories. And really what I would do here is I would take a screenshot of this or a picture of it and put this in my notes, because I think this is one of the easiest and best ways to help organize the information that we've gone over today. And it'll just help you in the long run keep everything organized in your head and remember it for the test. And so it tells you which brain parts are involved, the cerebellum or the basal ganglia or the hippocampus and the frontal lobes, and then what sorts of information are being processed within those areas. So I think this is a really what we've gone over today. So screenshot it, take a picture, whatever, but I would keep this in your notes for sure. And so now that we've gotten our memory stored in long term, the next key to memory is how do I get it out, right? It's stored in my memory somewhere. Now it's test day. How do I pull this information out of my brain and use it for the test? And so there's basically three measures of retention, like how you can like test or remember information. And so it's recall, recognition, and relearning. And I would say, if we wanted to compare this to the AP test, recall is kind of like the FRQ question. You have to come up with what the term means completely on your own, and you have to apply it to the situation. And so there's usually not like a hint or anything like that. A lot of times on like multiple choice, right, you can use the the question to help kind of guide your answer. There's like some hints and things in there. But for the FRQ, it's like, hey, here's this word. How do you apply it to the situation? So you have to be able to recall that information completely on your own. Recognition then is more like a matching or a multiple choice test. The information is there. You just have to recognize what it goes with. So I have to recognize that term A matches with term C and that term B matches with term D. I don't have to come up with it out of thin air. I just have to recognize the information that's there. And sometimes when we learn or when things are stored in our memory, we have problems accessing it or retrieving that information. And that's where relearning comes in. And so I allow my students to do test corrections when they do poorly on an AP exam. And so they can come in and actually correct the problems that they got wrong. And so relearning basically is this idea that, well, you didn't successfully store this information last time in long-term memory. So this is how you can do it, so that next time it is in your long-term memory and you can retrieve it to use on the test. Other ways that we can retrieve information, these are just some little hints, and this is the last kind of topic that we're going to cover for tonight. Retrieval cues are important because they're basically like hints. Like I'm giving you a hint to help pull the information out. And so priming is one good example of our retrieval cues. Our sensory information can help us evoke certain memories and associations. Often priming happens kind of below our conscious awareness. So an example I always use of this is the summer I turned 16, my friend had an air freshener in her car that was just like a unique smell. And so anytime now that I smell an air freshener that smells like that, which isn't very often, immediately some of those strong memories of like driving around when I was 16 come to mind, because there's that sensory priming. That smell primes me then to think of that memory. And if you think back to the bio unit, we also talked about smell and memory being strongly linked, because smell is passing through right next to your hippocampus. And so a lot of times memory and smell are two strongly linked things. So that can prime you to think of and remember certain things. Context-dependent memory basically is just the idea that, like, if I study something in my room, I'm more likely to remember that information in my room. So if you study for the AP test in your room, it'd be really great if you could also take the AP test in your room. Unfortunately, you can't, but it's just an example of how kind of bringing yourself back to that situation and to that scenario can help you in the future remember information. And you know the trick, right? If you like get up in the living room and you walk to the kitchen to get something and then you forget why you went to the kitchen, if you walk back to the living room, a lot of times you remember, oh yeah, I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, because you returned to that context. Context-dependent memory says that it helps you remember what you were originally thinking. And then the last two retrieval cues have to do with state-dependent memory. So basically, our state of mind impacts how we learn, our emotional status, things like that. So if I'm studying and I'm sobbing because my boyfriend broke up with me, but I have to study AP psychology, the next time that I'm in that same sort of sad state of mind, I'll more easily recall the information that I studied when I was in that state of mind. Obviously not, I don't recommend trying to do that for AP Psych, because that can also impact your memory in other ways, but that's why sometimes we spiral when we're in a bad mood. If we are in a bad mood because one bad thing happened, we start to think about all these other bad things that have happened, and we kind of spiral in that regard, because our state of mind is bringing up all of those other memories that are linked to that same state of mind. And then lastly, the serial position effect says that basically we recall names, spaces, places, words on a list based on the order that we learned them. And so typically, if I gave you a list of 50 words to study, you'd remember the first few and the last few, and you'd forget most of them in between. This chart here shows that basically the first few terms, about 80% of people remember. The last few terms, almost 100% of people remember. But the middle list, the 8, the 12, the 16, less than 50% of people are remembering. So what I would suggest, again, as another study tip for this, is switch up the order that you study words in and study modules in, because you're more likely to remember the first and the last. But if you continually switch it up, then you're kind of overcoming the serial position effect and being able to remember more of the information. And so this is the last visual that I have for you today. It's another hierarchy, of course. But basically, this is a summary of everything that we've learned tonight. It starts with our sensory information. So our memory is fed by all of these visuals and sounds and things, this information that's coming in. And you can see there's tons of it. All those little bits of information are constantly hitting us. But only a few, maybe 10 of those things come to our short-term memory. And in our short-term memory, we work at encoding, we think about them, we remember them, but even then, a few of those pieces are lost. And so those few that aren't lost make it into long-term storage, where sometimes we might alter or even lose them further. And then there's the few that we can actually retrieve from our long-term memory, depending on our mood and our cues and our emotions and things like that. So this is a really good visual of the entire process that we've kind of talked about tonight for memories getting in.